Have you ever lied to yourself and then believed your own lie? You may have to think about that for a minute, but we've all done this. Only human beings have the ability to make up something and then believe the thing that they made up. We all do it because whenever desire kicks in, whenever it's, oh my gosh, I got to have that thing, or oh my goodness, I got to have that person, whenever it's the thing or the person, we will do whatever we have to do to convince ourselves that that's a good idea and we should go ahead and get that, even if we know it's not really a good idea. Now, what's so ironic about this is if somebody else came to us and gave us the same reasoning to do something that we give ourselves, we would be so offended by it. For instance, imagine this. Imagine you were shopping, online or in person, whatever, and somebody was trying to convince you to buy something, a salesperson maybe, and they looked at you and they said this: if you get home and decide you don't like it, you can just donate it. You'd look back at them and go, do you think I'm stupid? I'm not going to throw my money away. But some of you, I could tell by the chuckling, you're like, I have said that to myself. Well, I'll just buy it. If I don't like it, I'll donate it, right? Here's another one. I'll see that you already have one that does everything this one does, but this one's newer. It's like, yeah, what's the point? But again, we're all guilty of this. We have all had something that worked perfectly fine, but we had to buy another one because it was a newer model, even though the old one was still working. How about this? This gets a little more personal. Imagine if somebody said to you, well, yes, sir, it's wrong, so just don't tell anyone. You'd say, well, that's terrible advice. But we've all said, well, hey, it's wrong, but don't tell anybody. It'll all be fine. Ladies, this one is just for you. You ready? Sure, your husband would be hurt if you found out, but he isn't smart enough to find out. It may be true. You still shouldn't say it. And can you imagine, seriously, ladies, can you imagine if another lady walked up to you and said, oh, yeah, your husband's going to be so upset, but he's not smart enough to ever find out? You just go ahead and do it. I mean, you'd be so offended, but you tell yourself this, don't you? Now, I'm not just picking on you ladies. Guys, here's our side. Yes, your girlfriend would be devastated, but let's face it, she's not giving you what you need. Again, guys, we'd be so furious if somebody said that to us. But then it's like, no, she is more attractive than, and we come up with all these reasons. We have this uncanny ability to sell ourselves on ideas when there's something we want, and we know we're lying to ourselves, and we believe our own lies anyway. That's how you end up being your own worst enemy. So for the last 3 weeks, if you haven't been around here, we've been talking about what it is in you and what is in me that can cause us to be our own worst enemies. And we've identified 3 different preemptive habits. Preemptive habit is just a habit you develop before there's a problem, so there's not a problem. So we've said, okay, if you and I could just learn to pay attention to some things before they become a problem, it'll keep us from being our own worst enemy. And so to start the series, in week 1, we talked about this: just pay attention to your fears. Pay attention to your fears. Fear is something we all deal with. It always follows the unknown, the uncertain, and the unexpected. And all of us have to deal with that, so all of us feel fear. But if you give fear the steering wheel of your life, then it will become fatal. Fear will eventually wreck you. Fear will eventually drive you to make some decisions that you will regret. And we've all got stories about that. So we talked about, okay, here's what it looks like in the middle of fear. You and I have to learn to stop trying to control things we can't control, because that's our natural reaction to fear, and instead figure out how to surrender control to the only one who actually has control, and to trust him with it. Then last week we talked about this idea of paying attention to your narratives. Your narratives, they're the stories or the explanations that you tell yourself in your head for why certain things happen. They're the answer to the question of why. Well, why didn't they talk to me? Why didn't she text me back? Why did they say that? Why did they do that? Why did this happen in my life? And we come up with these narratives, and this ought to scare us all a little bit, because we assume our narratives are true, and then we live based on these self-created narratives. And we interact with and treat God a certain way, others a certain way, and ourselves a certain way, based on these self-created narratives. It ought to scare you, and it ought to scare me, because our self-created narratives aren't always true. And you can live your entire life being driven by a story or an explanation that you believe is true that's really not. So you got to learn how to pay attention to that. Today we're going to talk about this third one. It's pay attention to your tensions. Pay attention to your tensions. Now, there's a difference between tensions and fears. Fear is something that, I don't know how it's going to turn out. I don't know what's going to happen. It scares me. So that's fear. Tensions are different. Tensions are when your conscience gets dinged, and this has happened to all of us. Tensions are when you're wrestling with a situation and there's just something inside, you're about to make a decision, there's something inside of you going, you ought to slow down, you shouldn't do it, you ought to wait, you shouldn't do it. And it's usually around an issue of right or wrong, or around an issue of wise are unwise. So whenever you find yourself selling yourself on an idea, oh, you should go ahead and buy that because, and I know you'll have to swipe the card and put more debt on the card, but you should go ahead, or, you should get in that relationship, or you should get out, or you should, go ahead and do that, get in the deal, sign the contract, whatever it is. Whenever you find yourself doing that, and you feel this tension inside of you, you should pay attention to that tension. As a matter of fact, if you've only got 5 minutes to listen, today, and that's all you can focus, here it is in a nutshell. Here's how you pay attention to your tensions. Don't start selling, start listening. The moment you start selling, you should hit pause. The moment you find yourself selling yourself on an idea for why it's a good idea, you should hit pause. Stop selling yourself and start listening. But we do the opposite. Again, I'm as guilty of this as you are. Whenever you and I feel a tension, we don't slow down, we speed up. Because the tension, I don't want to feel that tension. That's uncomfortable. So I want to go ahead and make the decision I want to make and do what I want to do so the tension will go away and the decision's been made. I want to slap a sold sign on that as quick as I can. I don't want to keep having to sell myself on it. And so we will speed up and make decisions that we're uncomfortable with, that we feel tension about, just because we're trying to escape the tension. When in reality, we should not speed up, we should slow down. We should stop selling, start listening. We should hit pause. Your biggest regrets, my biggest regrets, I bet this is true for you. They happened because you felt a tension before you made that decision and you ignored it. You sped up instead of slowing down. This is what happens to all of us. You just sped right up. You ignored the tension. And then on the backside, as you look back, you go, yeah, I should have listened to that. And that tension may have been internal. That tension may have been created by somebody who came alongside you and said, hey, you should think about this. I don't think this is a smart move. Have you thought about? But all of us tend to blow right through these tensions, and then we end up being our own worst enemy. Now, you know this. Besides, here's the truth for all of us. We rarely have to sell ourselves on a good idea, do we? When's the last time you had to sell yourself on a good idea? Every now and then it happens, but that's usually related to fear and not attention. Most of the time, we know a good idea when we see one. We have to sell ourselves on ideas that deep down inside we know aren't good, aren't wise, aren't smart, but we want to do them anyway. Those are the ideas we sell ourselves on. But this puts you on a path to being your own worst enemy really quickly. Now, there's an Old Testament story, an Old Testament account that illustrates this really well. There are actually several of them, but I want to show you one of them today. It comes straight out of the Jewish scriptures, and what makes it so interesting, these scriptures are a history of the Jewish people, and history for the Jews would have been very different if this story would have ended differently. It would have been very different if this individual had not hit pause, stopped selling, started listening, and paid attention to his tension. We would have a very different story we were telling today. The story revolves around somebody you probably heard of. His name's King David. He was Israel's second king. But when the story takes place, David is not king. He doesn't have a crown. He is far from the throne. As a matter of fact, he has an APB out for his arrest when the story takes place. He is a fugitive, and he's on the run from the king. Now, to give you a little backstory and catch you up to speed, when David is a teenager, some of you may remember this story, when he's a teenager, he's the youngest of a bunch of brothers, and the prophet in Israel at the time, whose name was Samuel, shows up at David's house, and he looks at David's father and says, one of your sons is going to be the next king. I want to identify who he is. Well, Jesse lines up all of David's brothers except David. David's out taking care of Jesse's sheep. That was his job. And Jesse and his brothers thought so little of David, they were like, there's no way he's king material. They didn't even bother to bring him in. Meanwhile, Samuel starts looking at all of David's brothers, and he goes, well, not that one, not that one, not that one. When he gets to the end of the line, it was kind of embarrassing. He looked at Jesse and said, I'm sorry, it's a no on all of them. Do you have any more sons? And then Jesse kind of sheepishly, he's like, well, there's one, but you don't even want to see him. Not king material. And he finally brings David in, and Samuel says, well, that's the one. He's going to be the next king. The problem was Israel already had a king. His name was Saul. And in those days, the one thing you did not want to be was the next king when there was a current king, because you would never become king. He would just cut your head off and take the thread out, So nobody really wanted that role or that title. And Jesse and his brothers didn't think David had the ability to do it anyway. I think they thought Samuel just messed up. So what's so fascinating about this story is Samuel says it's David, and then Samuel leaves, and everybody goes back to life like normal. David goes right back out to taking care of the sheep. Nobody thinks anything of it. Until a few years later, David's still too young to be in the army, but all of his brothers are in the army, and there's a conflict between Israel and the Philistines. And Jesse looks at David and says, go check on all your brothers. So David goes to the battle lines to check on his brothers, and this is where the story takes place that so many of us have heard of. As David gets there, he hears this giant Philistine named Goliath who is cursing God, he's cursing the Israelites, and all of Jewish history changes. Because David is not going to tolerate it, and he marches right down with a slingshot and a stone. You've heard this story, haven't you? He kills Goliath, and then the Israelite army routs all of the Philistines, and suddenly David goes from nobody knows who he is to a celebrity in the land of Israel. As a matter of fact, they wrote a song that said, Saul has slain his thousands, which King Saul loved. But the second line was, David has slain his tens of thousands, and Saul didn't like that at all. So all of a sudden, Saul becomes jealous of David because of David's popularity. Some time passes. David becomes captain of the entire army of Israel. He eventually becomes King Saul's son-in-law, and his popularity grows and grows and grows to the point that Saul becomes so jealous he tries to kill David on more than one occasion because Saul realizes he is going to be the next king. My son Jonathan's not. I'm just going to take him out. And so David has to run for his life. And so he runs out into the wilderness there in Israel in a place called En-Gedi. I've never been there. Most of you probably never been there. But here's a picture of En-Gedi. Here's what it looked like. It was this barren desert wasteland out by the Dead Sea. That's the Dead Sea right there. And there were all these cliffs, and in En-Gedi, there were hundreds and hundreds of caves. You can see some of them here. Hundreds and hundreds of caves in the cliffs of En-Gedi. And so over time, this is a great place for David to hide. So hard to find him. It's like finding a needle in a haystack out there. But over time, other men in Israel who are down on their luck, who are destitute, who maybe are in debt and can't repay their debts, all of these men begin to gather in En-Gedi around David. And so David ends up with 600 men that he's leading out here in this wilderness. And they're trying to avoid Saul and run from Saul. And Saul had his spies, so Saul's got spies looking for David. David has spies looking for Saul's spies who are looking for David. And it's this big cat and mouse game that just goes on for years and years and years. Well, eventually, one day, some of Saul's spies get a good lead and discover where David and his men are in En-Gedi. And they discover the particular area where they believe they are, and so they send word back to Saul, and they say, we have found them. Here's our chance. And that's where we're going to pick the story up. Here's what happens. It says, so Saul took 3,000 able young men from all Israel, and he set out to look for David and his men near the Crags of the Wild Goats. What a great name, by the way. Isn't it? It's a lot better than Almo or Lynn Grove. Crags of the Wild Goats. Anyway, that has nothing to do with today. So this was a particular area in En-Gedi. This is where they've discovered that David is. What's interesting to me about this is Saul took 3,000 men. David has 600 guys. This is a bit overkill. It is a 5-to-1 ratio. But Saul's not taking any chances. He's good at what he does. He knows he's a skilled warrior. And this is Saul's chance. He's finally going to put an end to this threat. And so the story continues that Saul came to the sheep pens along the way, and everybody back then knew where those were. And a cave was there. And Saul went in to relieve himself. Now, here's what had happened. Just imagine this. I'll take that back. Don't imagine that in a lot of detail, but just track with me for a minute, okay? You have gone on trips before with your family, and you know how this works. There are two sets of rules for who gets to stop and use a bathroom when. There's one set of rules for all the kids, everybody else in the car, and then there's another set of rules for dad, right? So the kids need to go, and it's like, nope, we got another 200 miles. You just hold it, son. When dad needs to go, it's where's the nearest exit. That's the way that works. Well, it's kind of like this here. So if you could imagine 3,000 soldiers, and you just saw a picture of En-Gedi. So these 3,000 soldiers are marching down this path with cliffs on both sides. And marching. And when a soldier needed to stop and go to the restroom, it was like, no, we're not stopping. You just catch up or whatever it is. But when King Saul had to stop, everybody stopped. So can you imagine? I mean, you're trying to get 3,000 men to stop. It's like, why are we stopping? Saul's got to go again. So that was pretty much what's going on. They finally get the entire army stopped, And then Saul walks into this cave to use the restroom, which, by the way, I'm just going to help you out. Ladies, at least. I think you gentlemen understand this. A lady asked me after the first service, I can't figure out why it took Saul so long in the cave to pee. I said, he wasn't peeing. So anyway, there you go. Now you know. If he was peeing, the guy would just stop right there. That's how guys do it. He'd have done it right in the past. So anyway, that's probably more information than you need to know. But Saul goes in this cave to use the restroom, and this is a middle schooler's favorite story. It's why they don't let me down there. This is the only story I'd ever talk about. So anyway, he goes in this cave, and what he doesn't know is this. David and his men were far back in the cave. So what David has done, his spies saw Saul's army coming, told David. David split up all of his 600 men into small groups. And again, there are hundreds of caves, so he goes, you just find a cave somewhere, you hide. Let's all hide, let the army march by. You saw the pictures. You're going to see them, you're going to hear them. And then once they're far out of reach, we're all going to assemble, and we're just going to go in the different direction. This was David's plan. So Saul walks into this cave, and you know what it's like when you've been out in the bright sun and then you walk into a dark place. It takes your eyes a little while to adjust. He doesn't walk too far into the cave. Meanwhile, this cave is deep and way back in the back. David and his men are sitting there. Not all of the 600, but a handful of his closest men. The men who protected David day in and day out. Can you imagine what they must have thought when they saw the king who was hunting them walking into their cave? What are the odds? What are the odds? These guys look at David and they're like, you got to be kidding me. This is your moment. This is your moment. This is your chance. This is our chance. We've been waiting for freedom. You've told us you're going to be king one day. Well, today is the day. You told us God was going to clean up this mess one day and put you in charge. Well, this is the moment. God had to have done this. What are the odds Saul, out of hundreds of caves, would walk in our cave if God wasn't delivering him into your hand? Matter of fact, their thought was, God has delivered David's enemy right into his hands. Christians sometimes use this phrase, and it's not a favorite phrase of mine, but they'll say, well, it's a God thing. You ever heard somebody say that? Well, it's a God thing. I'm like, no, you just got a parking spot up close. That God had nothing to do with that. But anyway, they'll say it's a God thing. Well, they were back there in the back of the cave going, David, this is a God thing. God has orchestrated all of this. This is your moment. And they're also thinking, we are moments away from having our freedom back too. We're moments away from being able to go reunite with our family. This is incredible, David. Let's take advantage of it. And so the story tells us, the men said, this is the day the Lord spoke of when he said, today the Lord is saying to you, I will give your enemy into your hands for you to deal with as you wish. And so, you know what David did? David crept up unnoticed. He just crept up. Again, he had a ways to go. He's in the back of the cave. Saul has no clue what's going on. And David begins to creep and creep and crawl and crawl. But somewhere along the way, we don't know when, but somewhere along the way as he was creeping up, David began to feel a tension inside of him. And it wasn't excitement. It wasn't, oh my gosh, this is so awesome. Look what God just did for me. No, it was a different kind of tension. This was an internal tension. As a matter of fact, if you keep reading the story, it tells us that David was conscience stricken. It was one of those tensions that David went, something just doesn't feel right about this. And somewhere along the way, it dawned on him, wait a minute. I am about to murder the king. Well, yeah, David, but look at what all he's done to you, and you don't deserve it. You're innocent. David's going, yeah, but it doesn't change the fact I'm about to murder the king. This is pretty black and white. God said, thou shalt not kill. And I'm about to kill the king. I'm about to replace what God put in place. God's the one who gave Saul the throne. And yeah, God promised me the throne in the future, but it's not my job to get the throne the way I want. It's not my job to disrespect the king and kill him. And as David crawls, he realizes this is wrong. He pays attention to the tension. He stops selling himself on the idea, oh, yeah, God brought Saul in here just to kill him. This is all God's doing. He's orchestrated it for you. He's just laid it out. He stopped selling himself that this is a good idea. And he hits pause, and he starts listening to the tension inside of him. And instead of creeping up and cutting off Saul's head, he creeps up and he just cuts off a corner of Saul's robe. And he turns around and he crawls all the way back to his men. Meanwhile, his men are in the back of the cave watching, and they're furious. They're starting to think to themselves, are you kidding me? This is the guy we thought was going to be the next king. This is the guy we pledged our loyalty to, and now he won't even do what needs to be done. And so by the time David gets back, they're beside themselves. They're on the brink of mutiny. They're ready to take matters into their own hands. And now David has a different problem. His problem is not Saul chasing him, it's his own men turning on him. And he's got to explain to them why he paid attention to this tension and didn't act on what seemed like so obviously the right thing to do. Here's how the story tells us it went. He said to his men, "The Lord forbid that I should do such a thing to my master, the Lord's anointed, or lay my hand on him. For he is the anointed of the Lord." Yeah, but he's not acting anointed. He doesn't care about God. Look at what he's doing. To which David's going, no, it doesn't matter. God still put him there. And yeah, I know what God's will is for my life, but I'm not going to take a shortcut to get to God's will. That never works out. I've got to experience God's will for my life in God's way and God's timing. And this just isn't it. There's no way that I can justify killing the king. Besides, I don't want this to be a part of my story. I don't want one day, years and years from now, for my grandkids to be gathering around going, "Hey, Papa, tell us that story of how you became king, how you killed the other king while he was on the potty. Tell us that one. That one's awesome." It's like, how embarrassing would that be? You know what this would have caused David to do? Think about it. This would have caused David to be a liar for life. This would have caused David, whenever anybody asked him how you became king, you know this because you've been there. This would have caused him to alter the story a little bit, wouldn't he? He wouldn't have given all the details and all the facts. He would have changed how he told it to make himself look a little better. And in this moment, he realized that he paid attention to the tension, so he looks back at him and he goes, no, guys, we can't do this. I know it seems right, but it's not right. And with these words, David sharply rebuked his men and didn't allow them to attack Saul because they were going to kill him. And Saul left the cave and he went his way. David was so close to doing the wrong thing. David was so close to forever changing his future. David was so close to losing, think about this, to losing the respect of the people that he would one day lead. David was so close to changing the history of the Jewish people forever. For the worse, not the better. But he stopped selling himself that it was a good idea. He started listening. He hit pause. He paid attention to the tension. Now, my question for you is, are you close? Some of you are. Some of you are close to making a decision that you have convinced yourself is the best thing to do. There's nothing wrong with that. It's going to be fine. But you're ignoring attention. You're close. And you're ignoring your conscience. You're close. For those of us who are Christians, we would say we're ignoring that still small voice of God's Spirit going, nope, pay attention to the tension. You don't want to go there. You don't want to do that. You don't want to make yourself a liar for life. You don't want to make a decision that for the rest of your life, you don't want to tell all the facts because it makes you look bad. And so you change the story a little bit. You don't want to do that. If you're close, I'll tell you, you and I, we should just do what David did. If you're close, you should hit pause, stop selling, start listening. Or else you will end up being a liar for life. You'll end up doing something that you don't want to tell that story just like it happened to anyone. So, Saul has no idea. Finishes his business, walks back out. Soldiers are out there going, finally, we can move, you know. So he gets on the mule and off they all go again, all 3,000 of them. They march on down a ways, and David lets them get far enough away that they're not a threat, but close enough they can still hear and see him. And this is such a dramatic moment. You can read about this for yourself. It's pretty fascinating. David walks out of the cave, and he turns, and he yells at Saul, King Saul. And Saul turns around. But all 3,000 soldiers turn around with him. And there David is, holding in his hand, not the head of King Saul, but just the corner of his robe. And every soldier standing there knew that should be the king's head. That's the cave he just went in. David didn't kill him when he had his chance. And David makes this incredible speech. I'm not going to read it all to you. He makes this incredible speech trying to explain to Saul and to all the army with him, hey, I am not who you say I am. I am not trying to overthrow the throne. I'm going to leave that to God. I'm going to be loyal until God puts me in that place. And in the midst of it, he makes this point. He says, may the Lord, he's talking to Saul, may the Lord judge between you and me. And may the Lord avenge the wrongs you have done to me. But my hand will not touch you. This was David's way of saying, Saul, you are wrong. What you're doing is wrong. But I'm not going to take responsibility for paying you back for what you're doing because that's not my job. That's God's job. I'm going to leave the justice and the judgment to him. I'm going to do what's right. This is so important. Here's what David realized in the cave that day. David decided not to use Saul's bad behavior as an excuse for his own bad behavior. He's going, no, Saul, you're in the wrong. And if I killed you, all the people around, they go, well, you know, he had it coming. But I'm not going to use your bad behavior as an excuse for my own bad behavior. I'm not going to justify your wrong as a reason to be wrong myself. Two wrongs don't make a right. So let me ask you, are you considering behaving badly based on someone else's bad behavior? Oh yeah, normally I wouldn't, but after what they said, I'm going to do that. I'm saying that back. I'm going to let them have it. I'm going to tell them about, I know they did, so I'm going to take too. They took from me, I'm going to take from them. They treated me this way, I'm going to treat them that way. Listen, you don't want to do that. Are you considering becoming like someone you don't even like? That's what happens when you retaliate. You become like someone you don't even like. It's not worth it. It is never worth it. It wasn't worth it for David. It's not worth it for you. Here's what's fascinating to me about this. In that moment, Saul was not humiliated by David's military prowess. He wasn't humiliated by David's intelligence, although David had all of that. In that moment, with an audience of 3,000 Israelite soldiers and 600 of David's men, Saul was humiliated by David's humility. He was humiliated by David's character and self-control. He was humiliated because all 3,600 men there that day, it was so obvious to them. David has character, Saul does not. They knew if the roles were reversed, they knew exactly what Saul would have done. David has self-control, Saul does not. David has humility, Saul does not. And that story spread throughout all Israel until everyone knew, did you hear about David and what he didn't do? Did you hear about David and how he spared the king's life? And he became known throughout the land for his character and humility. He earned the respect of an entire nation because he paid attention to the tension. And he didn't try to accomplish what God had promised would happen in his own way and in his own timing. So, is there a tension that deserves your attention? If so, you should let it bother you. Is there a tension you've been trying to avoid? You're just speeding up because you want to get away from it as quick as you can? No, you should slow down. Stop selling yourself on it. Start listening. Hit pause. Pay attention to that tension, and you let it bother you until you figure out exactly why you feel the tension. If you get to the bottom of it and you realize, wait a minute, this tension has nothing to do with I'm about to do something unwise. This is just I'm afraid. This is just I'm not sure. Okay, well then fine. Go ahead. But if you discover, no, this tension's here for a reason, then you need to pause. And I bet for a lot of us, there's a tension we need to pay attention to right now. There's conversation that you're just certain you're going to have. I mean, people have told you, oh, you shouldn't do it. Don't go say that to them. But you're going to do it because they deserve it. And they said, no. They're going to send that text. I'm going to send that email. I'm going to get in that contract. I'm going to sign that agreement. I'm going to go ahead and make that purchase. And there are people going, or internally you feel like, no, you shouldn't. You don't have it. It's not smart. And you go, no. And you've sold yourself on the idea. You're about to do it. You're about to do something relationally that's going to have some long-term effects, but you're at a point where you've sold yourself. It is a good idea. I want to do this. I'm going to do this, and I don't care what it does to them. It's a tension that deserves your attention. You should let it bother you until you figure out exactly why it's there. And then if you're about to do something that's unwise, if you're about to do something that's wrong, if you're about to choose bad behavior and excuse it because of the bad behavior of somebody and what they've done to you, you need to stop and pay attention to that tension. Because it will never work out for you in the long run. It never, ever does. Now, for those of us who are followers of Jesus, this goes one step further. Because we believe that tension is often created by the Spirit of God inside of us. And the only reason we have the Spirit of God, now think about this, the only reason we have access to God and His Spirit, to tap on our conscience, to create a tension when we're about to do something we're going to regret. The only reason we have access to God and His Spirit is because Jesus came and died on a cross and rose again to make it possible for us to be part of God's family. And when we became part of God's family, God said, I'm giving you your spirit, my Spirit now, and I'm going to be here to guide you through the rest of your life. So think about this from His perspective. Here we are, and Jesus has sacrificed His life so that we can have access to the wisdom of God and to the Spirit of God. And then God's Spirit, in that still small voice, or God's Spirit with that gentle little tap, begins to create some tension inside of us. Don't do that. That's not wise. Don't do that. You're going to regret it. And we just blow by it in spite of all the price that He's had to pay, in spite of all the love He's trying to show us, in spite of the fact He has nothing but pure intentions to help us. We blow right by it. How smart is that? So I think God would look at us and say, come on. I have placed my Spirit inside of you. Pay attention to my Spirit. Pay attention to my Spirit. Pay attention to the tension. Stop selling yourself on ideas you know really aren't good. You rarely have to sell yourself on a good idea. Hit pause, start listening, and pay attention. So that you don't become your own worst enemy. Because if you speed up, you will. If you ignore it, you will. You'll put yourself right on a path to being your own worst enemy. Now, for a lot of us, I'll tell you where we feel tension the most. I think you can relate to this. We feel it in relationships. This is where we almost always feel it. Every now and then we're making a decision that feels isolated and, it's just about me and we feel a tension. But most of the time the tension relates between us and somebody else. I want to say that. I want to do that. I want to go there and they don't, whatever it may be. It's usually a two-way street. In other words, when we blow through the tension, when we just speed up instead of slowing down, it doesn't just impact us. It impacts the people closest to us as well. Some of you are feeling a lot of this tension in your life right now, and it's in relationships. Particularly, it's in a marriage relationship. It's in a dating relationship. And there are choices that you are wanting to make. There are choices that they are wanting to make. And you're feeling tension about it, but you just want to speed up and blow through it anyway, and you're not considering the bigger picture, and you're not, in some cases, considering the other person even. And you don't even really care what this does to the marriage or what it does to the dating relationship or what this is going to mean long term. You just want what you want, so you're going to do it. We've all been there. But now you're sitting there thinking, okay, well, what does this look like? How do I stop selling myself on an idea that's a bad idea and pay attention to the tension in this relationship? Because it's not just me, it's me and them. So next week, we're starting a brand new series. I'm really excited about this because we're going to drill down deeper into how this looks in relationships. The series is called Love, Dates, and Heartbreaks. Love, Dates, and Heartbreaks. So we're going to spend a few weeks talking about some principles that will help all of us who are in relationships. And if you're somebody who's not in one and you don't ever plan to be in one, that's okay. These principles actually work in any relationship, but we're going to talk about specifically what it looks like in the midst of marriage and dating, and how you deal with tensions that you feel in those relationships that are most important and closest to us. So I wanted to give you a sneak peek of what the series was about and what it's going to be like. Take a look at the screens.
Begun.